Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hi, thank you very much for coming on to the Sociology Show podcast. Do you want to start by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I am Dr Shantey Francis. I am a senior lecturer at Nottingham Trent University, criminologist by heart, but I teach on the youth justice course there and have done some cross-teaching on some other courses as well, but my main focus is youth justice. My research background is looking at how young people understand the term violence. So anything to do with young people, youth justice, crime and violence, that's kind of my arena, really.
Brilliant. Thank you. And I'm always interested how people got into that field. What was your kind of journey through sociology to get to where you are at the moment?
Yeah, so it was an interesting one, really. So, you know, I did my undergrad and then I went on to my master's straight afterwards. And once I'd finished that, I, funnily enough, bought a big issue, which I never normally buy. But there was a job advert in the back of there for a fantastic charity called the Children's Society. And they were looking for a youth project worker to work with children in disadvantaged areas, try to keep them off the streets, children who are high risk. And I thought, you know what, this aligns with kind of what I've been studying, what I'm interested in. I'll give it a go. And I went and it opened my mind to, and you know what, I'll be completely honest, it kind of burst my bubble a little bit in terms of, you know, life isn't just rainbows and happiness for all children. Some children have it extremely difficult. And I was working within one of the projects, which was based up in the northwest of the UK. Highly disadvantaged, wonderful people, wonderful children to work with, brilliant project. Unfortunately, a lot of the projects, due to kind of austerity and things, have been closed down because they rely on a lot of funding. And I can only imagine that's been impacted worse since kind of the COVID pandemic. But it's by doing that, by taking that step and that kind of leap of faith, that's what's brought me to then want to pursue young people in general within my research further. And that's kind of what pushed me to want to pursue my PhD. And I did that based kind of in Nottingham. So yeah, that was kind of like my journey into that. And it's one that I really value, being able to be part of that opportunity, be part of that charity, see how the world is working in a lot of different ways and how context is extremely important when you're working with young people, when you're looking at disadvantage and crime, and how society and context plays a massive part in that. Because I think a lot of the time when we're working and looking at young people and trying to understand why they're committing these crimes, I think we take a very much kind of city-based and even more so a kind of London-centric perspective on youth. Everything happens in London. It's the epicenter of the UK, knife crimes at an all-time high, poverty and disadvantage is the worst, in London. But we've got these pockets of young people within the UK, and particularly within the rural side of the UK, which is kind of what I try to look at within my research also, where disadvantage is extremely high, but the context is just different. So I think it's sometimes important not to just kind of take into account of context, but also, take into account youth voice as well. These young people do have things to say and they want to discuss these issues and, how it's affecting them, but how it's affecting them within their social and cultural context. But yeah, my journey it was an interesting one. I value it and I appreciate it. And I always, even when kind of teaching my students, I always tell them about my journey and how things can just fall into place, you know, obviously with hard work and things like that, but, you know, fall into place from different areas and, you know, take those opportunities while they're there, because they can really change the trajectory of how you process information, you know, your perspectives on life and everything. I think I'll forever be grateful for that experience.
Yeah. And you just mentioned that pockets of areas, and I may have read too much into the media myself, but Nottingham has certain issues, should we say? Is that a fair point to say?
Yeah, definitely a fair point. Nottingham has had a turbulent history, I think, and there are certain areas within Nottingham which I think would be described, or maybe used to be described, as no-go areas. And I know a lot of students who come to the city who aren't from here, they would say, you know, oh, I wouldn't go to such and such a place, or yeah, I've heard about that place, and, you know, it's, you know, I've been told not to go there. But I think it's again, it's all about that context. You know, we have students who are from those areas, and it can, you know, some of those debates that we have in class sometimes can be quite heated. But I think, again, it's, you know, I think if we explored it theoretically, it's kind of looking at those kind of moral panics about certain areas, creating those folk devils, out of, you know, those newspaper articles where crime's the highest and things like that. And I think sometimes we need to think a bit deeper about why certain areas are having those problems. And I think more importantly, it's not the people that are necessarily the issue, but actually it's much far deeper rooted than that. And structurally, I think there needs to be a lot more investment in those types of communities. Better healthcare, you know, better access to a variety of different foods, better education system in place for the young people who are attending those schools that may be overpopulated or understaffed. So I think structurally it needs a lot more work, rather than just thinking, you know, it's the people's fault. It's their fault why they're in that situation. And I think a lot of the time, the way the news is portrayed, and particularly when we're looking at it from, you know, the young people who live there, it's, you know, the young people are the problem. They're the ones causing all the antisocial behaviour and all the crime and violence. But I think structurally there's a lot more to it than, you know, and those conversations, although difficult, need to be discussed, you know, with government bodies and local authorities, anyone who's willing to listen, really. Yeah. There's always a reason behind these things, isn't there? I mean, a good sociologist should always think structurally about what's behind the scenes, certainly. And then I know you said right at the top of the show there that youth violence in particular. And I'm going to ask a question which I don't know how easy it is to operationalise, but what is the definition of violence? Are we talking physical, emotional? You know, how do you define what violence is? That is a tricky question. Yeah. I think when people discuss violence, they instantly think violence against the body, against the person. And I think sometimes when we think of violence, I think, you know, we initially go to that, but also we do need to think about mental violence, emotional violence. Sometimes it can be violence that's not necessarily tangible, but it can cause deep-rooted issues within an individual. And things such as bullying, you know, that's a form of violence, even if it's just through keyboard warriors on the, you know, on the other end of the screen, or, you know, through mean words that's said to somebody. That could be a form of violence. And I think it's that interpretation of what we understand violence to be is where the key message is. Because when I speak to young people and I ask them, you know, how do you define violence? They instantly go to those tangible efforts. So the kicking, the punching, you know, the hitting or the pulling of the hair. But then when we start to unpick, why do they think of it like that? Because, you know, that's what they've been shown, that's what they've seen. But then they unpick it further and they say, actually, you know, yeah, bullying, I suppose, is a form of violence, but we don't necessarily get taught that in school. We just get told that it's wrong. You know, it's interesting to see how others define violence. And I think for myself, if I were to define violence, it would encapsulate all of those arenas, not just the physical, but also the emotional and the mental as well, because I think that plays an important part in how we can provide a holistic understanding of what violence is in itself, rather than just kind of this 2D approach that's usually spoken about.
Yeah. Is that actually how the young people themselves tend to view violence? Do they think about it very much in a physical way?
Yeah. And I was talking to children who were kind of like high school age. So they were thinking about what's happening within their own environments at schools or colleges. And yeah, so for them, it was extremely kind of physical. And then interestingly, they started to touch upon bullying as, they didn't really notice it as violence as first. But then when they started to think about it a bit deeper, they were like, oh yeah, actually, you know what, violence and bullying, I suppose, are kind of the same. It's just we've never really had that discussion in school. When they talk about violence in school, that it's always separate from bullying, and then bullying would be a separate assembly, or discussion. So they said it's interesting that they've never really put those two together before, even though they fall within the same brackets. So yeah, it was kind of interesting to hear them speak about that, really, because I would have thought that those two would have come under the same thing. But interestingly, for those particular students, it didn't.
Thank you. And do you want to say a little bit more about your own research into the topic of youth and violence?
Yeah, so it was kind of like my PhD research. It focused on how young people understand the term violence and, the things that they attribute to it within their own social and cultural context. And this was based within 2 locations within the UK. One was up in the northwest of the UK, which was a much more rural location. And one was based kind of within the Midlands, which is a much more kind of city centre, urban, if you will, location. And just kind of getting those 2 perspectives from the various young people that took part within that research there. And it was interesting to see kind of how, my research wanted to bring out that youth voice. And I think sometimes we can really kind of misunderstand young people because it is a turbulent age, I suppose, in many respects, and also just making sure that their voices are heard on on issues that are pertinent to them, and not necessarily not wanting to kind of adulterize any views, particularly pertaining to young people. So, youth violence is kind of a hot topic, I suppose, and has been for a while, and particularly when I was doing this research. And so I just really wanted to let the young people speak on that topic, seeing as it was something that was being spoken about them, but no one was really talking to them. So that's kind of what my research is looking at. I would love to take that further at some point. I've got a few things lined up and a few papers that I want to write, etc. But yeah, that was kind of like what my research looks at. And it was, thoroughly enjoyable experience. There were some heated moments between the young people when they were discussing what they thought violence was. Race came into it a lot of the time, terms that I hadn't heard for a while, particularly within the northwest rural areas, such as, they use the term coloured.
Oh, really?
And I was like, I'm a mixed race female, and I was the only person of colour within that area at the time doing the research. Didn't have an impact on my work at all. I don't know if it's because they were familiar with me from, the projects I used to work in over there. But yeah, it was predominantly white area. The term coloured was used frequently, not with any malice, not within any intent to harm. But again, that's what I mean with, and I didn't want to take offence to it because I knew they weren't coming from a bad place. It was mainly because that's the context, and that's what I mean by context, social context. Sometimes when we're looking at particularly sensitive issues, and when they were using that term coloured, it was initially a shock, but also I had to remember this may be a common term within this area for them that they're not using in any type of prejudicial way, but just a term for description. And I think for them, that's what it was. They didn't, may I say, maybe they didn't even know any better. And also the town was not diverse at all. And the closest city to them was 40 minutes away by car, for which many of them didn't really have. And the bus and transport links were very poor. So they were almost cut off from the rest of the world. And the way in which they were using this term coloured, so I should probably give it a bit of context. The way in which they were using this term coloured was kind of to describe the ways in which the media are portraying violence. So they're saying, you know, when we see violence on TV, we understand that the media are using particular types of people in certain violent acts. So fighting, or, you know, you see things on Instagram and there's groups of people fighting. They say, we always see coloured people doing that. Mm. So they're saying, we understand that the media can sometimes twist things. So it was interesting to hear them kind of unpick how they're seeing violence and what's informing their understanding of violence, which I thought was just really refreshing to have that. Or it was quite a deep conversation, really, I suppose, when you're talking to kind of 13, 14-year-olds. And, you know, and you ask them these questions. Has anyone ever asked your opinion on what violence is or what violence means to you? And they're like, we've never been asked that question before. You know, not in school, nowhere. So they were quite eager to speak about it, I suppose, because it's one of those, I don't know, interesting topics, you know, violence and crime. Everybody wants to know or have that discussion around it. So I suppose that was a bit of a benefit for me, really, doing that research. But yeah, no, it was absolutely brilliant. I really enjoyed it.
And you just mentioned questioning. Was it what was your methodology? Was it all in interviews, group interviews, informal, formal?
Yes, so it was purely qualitative, my work. I started off doing kind of the mind mapping, brainstorming of the questions. They used the term violence, and I said, you know, to break the ice, you've got this word violence, write down or draw or however you feel comfortable, anything associated with that, just to kind of get them, you know, get their minds going on the topic. That brought out some interesting stuff. I then took that away, kind of looked at that, and then that informed kind of the main topic areas of what I wanted to focus on when I moved towards focus groups, which I did with kind of a male focus group, female focus group, and then kind of a mixed gender one. And this was kind of based on age ranges. I did this, all the methods spoken about were used within both areas. And then this then informed my one-to-one interviews that I did with a select few of young people, you know, those who are available to take part. So kind of each method informed the other, and they all kind of work really nicely together and provided me with some great data. I just kind of wish I almost had more time to just keep collecting data, but sometimes it gets to a point where you do get kind of data saturation and the same type of things will be said. So yeah, it was, after a while, it was time to kind of call it a day and start analysing, really. But no, the methods really helped, and I do really value kind of qualitative research, because I do feel, you know, it does give you that in-depth understanding, which you wouldn't normally get from a survey. And with young people as well, I think it's really hard to get them to sit through, you know, a 5-page questionnaire or a survey, whereas, you know, a 15-minute talk with them can reveal so much more. So yeah, it was brilliant. I really enjoyed it.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
And do you mind getting stuck into some of those findings? You know what? Obviously, you would like to have done even more and more, but what were your kind of overall findings from the research?
Yeah, so with the research, kind of the main findings, the things that I wanted to really push across was the importance of youth voice. Race kind of played a big part as one of the main findings, and also media. So with regards to race, it was very much the young people who took part from a diverse range of cultures and ethnicities, particularly kind of within the inner city cohort that was taking part. And within this, they had, especially within the focus groups, had really interesting discussions about who they thought violence included, what the term violence meant to them, and what images came to mind when they thought of the term violence. And I will never forget, there was this young Asian girl and a slightly older mixed race boy who was quite tall, looks a bit older than he was for his age. And those two were within this focus group having a discussion, And I said to them, when you think of the term violence, what images come to mind? And she instantly pointed to him.
Wow.
And I was like, oh, okay. And, it was, and this is the bit that kind of blew me away. He said, I completely understand why you think that.
Wow.
No arguing. No one kind of kicked off. I really thought, oh my God, I'm going to have to split up a fight here. It was just about, getting ready to split them up, get the boxing gloves out. I thought, oh gosh, it's going to really get heated. But no, he sat back, he just looked at her and he said, I completely understand why you think that. And then he let her speak. And she just says, yeah, because he's slightly darker, I think of him when I think of the term violence, it's him who I point to. She went, but I know he's not violence, but that's just the image that pops to my mind.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay. And he says, yeah, I'm not surprised because, that's all the media portray is black people from, whichever shade. Black people are the ones that are fighting on TV. They're the ones you see that are being violent, the ones with the knives, etc. He says, so I don't blame her for thinking that, she would pick me when it comes to violence. He says, I'm not a violent individual. He says, but I do understand why. And the whole time she was just kind of nodding her head and being like, yeah, that's exactly why, And everyone else kind of just stayed quiet because I think they were in a bit of shock about how honest, they were being with one another. And it was just really insightful and kind of inspiring, really, because I think sometimes even adults can't even have that honest conversation without getting angry with one another, but they managed to do it and stay calm and really see each other's perspectives. And that was, I'll never forget that moment.
Yeah.
And, they don't even know each other really, which was even more wonderful that they could have that moment without getting any more heated than I expected. But yeah, race played a massive part. And that was a finding that not only came out within kind of that inner city cohort, but also within the rural cohort. They discussed that as well. It was very much kind of, this process of othering that I think can happen sometimes. And a lot of it was informed by the things that they see on Instagram, on Facebook. It's the media, I think, for young people at the moment is playing a massive role in shaping their perspectives because things can't be filtered. Well, obviously they can be filtered. We know about that. But I mean, in terms of what is true news, honest news, and what can be portrayed to invite a particular perspective. And some young people are very aware of how media can twist certain things, and some others just take it at face value. So I think it's also, moving forward with any type of research, I think it's always important not only to include young people within your work, but also get them to question why do they think the way they think? What's informed that understanding? Because I think that's the only way we're going to build kind of critical thinkers, moving forward, regardless of which profession, they choose to go into or where life takes them. But being that critical thinker, I think, is really important. And another kind of main finding which really came out was gender.
Yes.
Race, gender, media, all those areas, things that are I knew would be significant, but I didn't realize how significant they would be to young people at the time. And gender played a massive part, particularly looking at masculinity, status, and how that all played into the mix of how young people want to use violence or understand violence. It all plays into that mix. They even went as far as setting up fights at school, just to get likes for social media. They're saying, that's the done thing. If you want to be the top boy in school, you either have to be smart, you have to be good looking, or you have to be violent. They said, if you're not smart and if you're not good looking, violence is the way forward. And they were very open about it. And they said, that's just how it is nowadays. And yeah, it's kind of frightening, really, that feels like their only options.
Yeah, it's frightening, but also what's interesting is, and what I think you get from younger people is that kind of honesty. I think, if you're interviewing adults about we might say something a little bit more politically correct, or be careful what we say, or socially desirable answers. I think the beauty of the young people is they might be a little bit more frank about what they actually feel.
Yeah, I mean, they don't hold back.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes the younger you go, the more honest they are. But yeah, I think that's the beauty of doing research, and I like to say doing research with young people rather than on young people, is because I think it gives them a bit of that, a bit of that power back. It gives them a bit of just a bit of oomph to get involved with the research and to realize that their opinion and their voice matters in the wider context of things. And I think if there are pieces of research that I want to do that unfortunately it doesn't involve children and young people, but I would always strive to try and get that youth voice heard on some level, kind of going forward with any type of research. Because I just think, why not get them involved? If you're talking about issues about young people or issues that are relating to them in some way, then shouldn't they be the ones that we are talking to, rather than having adults talk about issues around young people? We want to hear their voice, their perspective, because the way I would perceive violence, for instance, or you or I would perceive violence, and the way a 10-year-old or even a 15, 16-year-old would perceive violence is going to be extremely different. So I think we need to have that discussion, and even more so, kind of coming back to some of the findings, the way violence is viewed within particular contexts is also different. So again, that social context was quite important. So within the rural setting, there were instances where if fights were happening within particular communities, it would be that the adults would be egging on the young people to continue fighting, which I thought was quite interesting, because you wouldn't think that the adults would be the one to break it up. But they said, no, it's kind of, it's quite common around here where the adults would kind of almost encourage, the young people to carry on. So that was kind of interesting. Whereas violence within kind of the inner city area was, it was much more heavily focused on kind of race. Both areas looked at gender equally and how that masculinity plays a big part in that. No boy wants to step down. They have to show that they're a man. And it's all about that status and once you've gained that status, there's only one way to kind of keep it. So that it was almost, very kind of that respect, understanding, keeping that status, that top boy underpinning, from a very young age. That's kind of how a lot of these young males were discussing it. So there was a lot of findings in there that I think I always enjoy talking about, because it's wild to me that we're having similar conversations that have been, the same things that have been being discussed, since the 60s or 70s, and it's the same findings coming out. So some of the more traditional theory that I think sometimes can get cascaded to the side, such as looking at, moral panics, folk devils, and there are many more looking at kind of different structural inequalities and things like that. I think sometimes that traditional theory is still extremely important and pertinent to today's society in order to understand it. That was kind of the main findings.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I mean, I've been teaching some of my students about really old theories, status frustration, and it is as applicable today as it was. I was reading a statistic recently about football violence becoming popular again, sadly. The sad old days that we thought we'd turned our back on in the 80s. But if you look at the reasoning behind young men getting involved in football violence, is frustration with society, cultures of resistance, lack of opportunities, increasing unemployment. Like you said, the same arguments that have been around for a long time.
Exactly. And it's quite interesting sometimes when you are speaking to students who, may not be as informed as, maybe they should be of their history. And I understand that it's history dating probably before their time, but understanding that actually, the things that happened within the 80s are reverberating still today. That's trickled down generation to generation, the lack of opportunity, getting stuck in that, the cycle of joblessness, unemployment, needing help with kind of money and being on benefits as part of that, and then not being able to get off that because, you're stuck within that cycle where jobs that are kind of employing aren't paying enough. And then you're stuck within that cycle. Should I get a job and get off benefits, or should I stay on because I'm going to be better off? And I think they're the types of discussions that not only are brilliant that, you're having with your students and that we should continue to have with our students, but actually they're the things that everyday people should be discussing. They're the questions that need to be placed to, government leaders and local authorities, and, and that historical context needs to be explored further, because it's not changed. And unfortunately, we're falling back into that trap where it's happening again. Mm. And, as you said, with the football hooliganism, it's going to be pure frustration. There's some young men, unfortunately, aren't seeing any light at the end of their tunnel, and they will be taking that frustration out on somewhere else. And with everything going up at the moment, there are going to be particular pockets of society that are going to feel it extremely much more than others.
Yes.
And, it's just sad to see, because we can see it unfolding and we know the reasons why, but unfortunately, for whatever reason, those, they're not being addressed. But I know, we could talk about that all day, but yeah.
I did want to ask you one other question in relation to that, because one of the theories that I've always been fascinated by is the theorist Katz, who talks about the attraction to violence and transgression and risk, particularly for young men, that sometimes it's not just about money or dropping out of society or unemployment, but there's just this attraction to it. I'm thinking again about something like football violence. If a group of men are surging down the street to go and charge at another group, or violence, smash something up, or vandalism, graffiti, or is there something underlying that there's something appealing or attractive about it to some people, irrelevant of their situation?
We can discuss the measures of austerity and the lack of status and the frustration that comes with that, but it's sometimes simply people are just attracted to doing or being involved with violence, whether it's because they think it's a fun thing to do because they were bored, or because it's kind of that herd mentality, particularly with large groups. Some people are simply just attracted to doing violence. And I think, we can discuss it in terms of looking at, is it the video games? Is it the violent films on TV? And I think it's more about, if we looked at it physiologically, the adrenaline rush, and I think it's the excitement that can come with that. You don't know how it's going to turn out. You're not sure what your next steps are. Is it just being part of something that's kind of fleeting, particularly with those, if it's big group fights. I don't know if you've watched kind of Football Factory and, Green Streets and things like that. And, it's, they make it out to be fun. It's just a bit of fun. It's, this is what we live for. Yeah. And I think sometimes it is interesting, sometimes we don't need the massive explanations around violence. Like you said, it's sometimes people are just wanting to get involved for the sake of it, because it is a bit fun. And unfortunately, I think sometimes they are, if we're looking at this from a young person's perspective, they can be sometimes the hardest young people to work with, because there's no reasoning for them to do anything. They just do it because it's an opportunity and they took it, and they know it's wrong, but they did it anyway. Yeah.
Because I was thinking, even those that don't get involved in violence, it seems to be a human fascination with it. If there's a school fight in the playground, you surge to go and watch it. I was never a fighter. No way would I want to be involved in a fight. But if I knew one was going on, I'd want to go and watch it. So
you still have that urge to just be, I just want to see what's going on. Who's got the first punch in? And you know what? I can't explain why we do that. Is it kind of this fascination with something being different, something that's out of the ordinary, that's not in our daily routine, that is just purely fascinating to us, that we don't understand why our feet are moving forward, but we're going to watch the fight anyway, and it's boxing. If we took it into kind of like a sporting arena and we're looking at boxing is highly entertaining. I really enjoy watching a bit of boxing. Do I understand that it's violent? 100%. It's one of the most violent sports out there, but I find it extremely entertaining, but not just because they're getting the hits in, but for me, it's more about looking at their technique, looking at, how they're ducking and diving, looking at their body formation. It's all of that encapsulated within it. So I think there are so many facets to what violence is and the reasons as to why one becomes intrigued by it. And that can be broken down into the physical, the wanting to do it, and simply just being a spectator of violence. I mean, sometimes when we're watching a good action film, it's not a good action film unless there's some decent fights within it, or there's something blowing up, or I mean, Fast and Furious, for example, those films, I've watched them all. They get bizarre, much more bizarre each time. But the amount of violence that's in them, the amount of things that blow up or people that get hurt, it just makes you want to keep watching them. It's one very interesting topic that I think I've only scratched the surface of, but I would love to keep digging deeper.
Yeah, I did read that the biggest consumers of kind of criminal literature or Netflix series are middle-aged women who are probably don't have any interest in committing violence, or maybe I'm stereotyping them.
Oh, interesting.
But they are the biggest consumers and watchers of it. So there must be something in our psyche that
there must be something going on with the middle-aged women then. Yeah. A guide to 101, how to get away with. Yeah, no, there's some interesting things going on. I think, I've always been interested in kind of the violence, the murder, the serial killers from a young age. And I don't think it's, by no way am I a violent person, but I find the mind intriguing, how we understand things and interpret information. And I find that the most fascinating part. And, there's been this, you've said it, Netflix, they've had this massive surge in true crime dramas. And I think it's, for me, it's brilliant. I think that they're an easy watch. The only problem is you don't just want to watch one, you want to keep watching them. But yeah, and it's, I had the opportunity to be on a true crime show, which was brilliant. And we looked at the case of the Washington snipers, which, a tragic case involving a young person. But again, it's looking at that young person as both. And I think when we look at violence and it is involving young people, we need to look at them not just as offenders, but also as victims of their own circumstance to some respect. Which I think is always really important to bear in mind when, doing work with young people or about young people, is that, yes, they may be somebody who has offended and broke the law, but also if we look behind that, why is it that they've broken the law? Are they a victim of an unjust and unequal society, possibly? So I think that's something to always bear in mind as well.
That's actually where I first came across you there. Are those videos on YouTube, or where can people watch them?
Yes, I think they'll be on YouTube, and they should be on BBC iPlayer. I can always provide you with the link afterwards. Yeah.
And on that note, is there any other details you'd like to give out if people want to follow you on Twitter or find out more about your work?
Oh, here's where I need to just refer to my notes. Yeah, so if they wanted to, I try to put updates now and again on Twitter. So my Twitter handle's just at Shantey, so that's SSHANTEYY at the end. And I'm also in the middle of kind of sorting out a TikTok at the moment, which is just for educational purposes. Yes, there may be some embarrassing dancing, but if it gets people interested in the topics of youth justice, I try to break down kind of sociological and criminological theory into kind of digestible bites, always with the positive energy, hints and tips for assignments, etc. So that's kind of what that platform's for. Twitter's more for kind of any research things that I'm kind of up to at the moment. But yeah, happy for anyone to kind of get in touch.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really do appreciate it. And it's a fascinating topic. We could have gone on longer, I think.
Yeah. No, it's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
No problem. Thanks again.
Thanks. Take care.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.